Silent nights, closed windows, a nursery where no more crying can be heard. In Victorian England, parents dreamed of only one thing: for their child to fall asleep. And doctors offered a solution: sweet, calm, soothing. It was called Mother's Quiet Syrup. A few drops, and the crying disappeared. A few spoonfuls, and the house was filled with silence. Too deep silence. No one asked why children slept for hours. No one asked why their chests no longer rose as they used to. No one wanted to know what was hidden in those beautiful glass bottles. Because sometimes silence is not peace. Sometimes silence is goodbye. Today you will hear the stories that were hidden behind closed doors, and you will learn at what price they bought peaceful nights. This is a story about sweet medicine, and about a dream from which they did not wake up.
When silence becomes suspicious.
Silence is a strange thing. It can be warm, homely, the kind that envelops you with a blanket. Or it can be something else, dense, heavy, suspicious. A silence that doesn't feel like sleep. A silence that sounds like someone in the room has stopped being there. After big cities, night always comes. And London knew how to be especially polite at night, with closed shop windows, kerosene lamps, and a tact that hid a lot of things. They didn't like questions here. They didn't like loud words. And most of all, they didn't like stories that made people uncomfortable, especially stories about children. In the Victorian world, a child had to be brought up, quiet, obedient. And if a child cries, it means the parents are not coping. And if they can't cope, they are poor, uneducated, or morally weak. This was an era where shame had the force of law. An era where a mother could love her child sincerely and at the same time fear her neighbors more than sleepless nights. Because in stone houses with thin walls, crying wasn't just a sound. Crying was a reputation. And in this era, a simple, sweet proposal appeared. Not a scream, not a scandal, not a miracle. Just a solution. It's not advertised with big posters on the street. It's not shouted by street vendors. It's passed on quietly, like a cough recipe, like advice from a midwife, like a little secret between women. Try it. It helps. They sleep after it. These are regular drops. It's nothing to worry about. Take it. Everyone here does it. And the bottle passes from hand to hand. Small, glass, heavy to the touch, with a vintage label on which, in neat font, are words that sound almost gentle. Mother's Quiet Syrup. Syrup for quiet children. Words that seem to be created so that they are not questioned. Because when a person does not sleep for the third night in a row, he begins to hear voices in his head. Not mystical, not romantic, but every day. Neighbors, landlord, employer, relatives, his own fear. You will break down. You will not be able to stand it. You will lose your job. You are a bad mother. And then the bottle ceases to be just a bottle. It becomes salvation, the key to silence, to normality, to being human again. But any salvation has a price, and sometimes it does not appear immediately, not as a blow, but as a trifle. Too peaceful sleep, too long sleep, too even breathing, too absent a child in the gaze when it wakes up. And here begins what they did not like to say out loud. Because in London in the 1880s, everyone knew. There are two things in the city that are better not to touch. The first is reputation. The second is other people's children. Let's imagine an ordinary night. Not a scary one. Ordinary. One where there is no rumble of thunder and theatrical shadows. There is only a room that smells of dampness, with a washed cloth and faint smoke from the lamp. There is a bed. There is a child. And there is a mother, sitting on the edge of a chair and counting the minutes. The child has been crying for an hour. The crying is not hysterical. It is exhausted, as if there is no strength in the throat, but there is a need. And the mother does what thousands of mothers have done before her, tries everything. Once, sings almost without a voice, puts on a warm cloth, whispers a prayer, drinks cold water so as not to faint, and then, from a shelf, from a drawer, from an apron pocket, takes out a bottle. She takes her time, because deep down in her heart there is always doubt, even if you hide it. The cap creaks, the glass chills her fingers, the liquid inside is viscous, like honey, sweet, almost pleasant. A spoon, a few drops, just a little. And then, as if someone cuts off the sound, the child does not fall asleep slowly. It seems to switch off. The mother freezes for a second, not from joy, from how quickly it happened. Silence comes instantly, and at that moment, the mother feels not only relief, she feels fear, because silence shouldn't come so quickly. She sits next to him and listens, counts the breaths. 1, 2, 3. The child is breathing, so everything is fine. But the minutes drag on, and the silence becomes not sweet, it becomes unnatural. The Victorian world did not know the modern terms that we would call it today, but it knew the feeling when something works too well. And when the mother finally allows herself to lie down, she falls asleep with a thought that sounds like a prayer. If only I could wake up in the morning. This is how the threat enters this story, not with a knife, not with a monster, but with a little bottle, and with the desire to just sleep. In those days, the Victorian city was a machine. Factories, docks, offices, and post offices worked. People were judged by their punctuality and their ability not to complain. Poverty and exhaustion were not considered a tragedy, they were considered character. And children were part of this mechanism. They were supposed to be comfortable. It sounds cruel, but that's how the logic of the era worked. If a child cries, the family suffers. If the family suffers, the work suffers. If the work suffers, order suffers. Order was God. Silence was prayer. Sleep was currency. And that's what the whole story of Mother's Quiet Syrup is based on. Because this is not just a story about one bottle. This is a story about a society that taught mothers to be afraid of crying, about people who wanted simple solutions, about a market that always senses weakness and offers a way out. And this is the story of how a small label could change the fate of a family. Now I want you to remember one thing. In such stories, evil almost never looks evil. It looks convenient, good, necessary. Evil comes in a glass, in a beautiful word, in the advice of an experienced woman, in a phrase that is whispered. Everyone does it. And that is why this story is so scary, because there is no monster here to point a finger at. There is only fatigue, shame, and a bottle that promises silence. And then we will go even deeper, to where these bottles began to appear, who made them, who sold them, And why didn't anyone rush to ask questions until it was too late? Because behind every label, there was a family. And behind every silent night, there could be a loss that was kept quiet for years. The pharmacy that sold silence. In the Victorian city, pharmacies were not just shops. They were places of trust. You went here when you were sick, when you didn't know what to do, when a doctor was too expensive, when you were embarrassed to ask your neighbors, when you needed a solution, a quick, simple, and preferably cheap one. The pharmacy smelled special, a mixture of herbs, alcohol, soap, paper, and something bitter that you couldn't name. On the shelves stood hundreds of little bottles, brown, green, and clear, with corks, wax seals, and paper labels written in beautiful handwriting. And each one promised something: soothing, relief, sleep, strength, healing. There was no screaming here. There were no tantrums. There was only polite waiting and quiet conversations. The pharmacist, in a clean apron with a neatly trimmed mustache, stood behind the counter like a banker behind a cash register. He knew the names of his regular customers. He knew who was from which street, who worked in a factory, who had recently given birth, who often came in with red eyes. He was part of the neighborhood, part of everyday life, part of the same silence that everyone so desired. And it was here, among the cough ointments, headache powders, and heart tinctures, that there were bottles that were not spoken about out loud. They were not lying in the window. They were not advertised with posters. But they were known about. They were whispered about in the queues. They were asked about them in half hints. They were said about them: "There's something for children, to help them sleep." And the pharmacist nodded, because he had heard it not for the first time, and not for the second time, and not for the 10th time. Let's imagine this scene. Morning. Dim light breaks through the display window. The air is still cold. On the counter are scales, measuring cups, a mortar and pestle. A woman enters. She doesn't look poor, but she doesn't look rich either. Neat, in a dark coat, with a basket in her hand. She speaks quietly but clearly. "I was told you have syrup for children." The pharmacist doesn't raise his eyebrows. He's not surprised. He doesn't ask questions. He takes a small box from under the counter. He opens it. He takes out a bottle. The glass is heavy. The liquid inside is dark, viscous. The label is simple, neat. Mother's Quiet Syrup. He places it between himself and the woman, as if he's conveying something valuable, as if something that demands respect. "It helps," he says calmly. "A lot of mothers take it." She hesitates. Not for long, but long enough for the fear to wake up. Is it safe? The pharmacist doesn't lie, but he doesn't tell the whole truth either. It's a calming syrup, an old recipe. It's been used for years. Years. The word always sounds convincing. She takes out the coins, puts them on the counter, and picks up the bottle. At that moment, she's not thinking about the composition, not about the consequences. She's thinking about sleep, about lying down next to her child, about how he will close his eyes without fear of hearing crying, about how he will wake up not from a scream, but from the morning light. And the pharmacist also thinks about his own, about turnover, about regular customers, about reputation, that he is not a doctor, he simply sells what is allowed to be sold. There are no villains in this deal, only the system. In Victorian Britain, Pharmacists were half doctors, half merchants. They mixed powders. They prepared syrups. They sold tinctures according to their own recipes. The law allowed a lot. Control was weak, and trust was enormous. If the bottle said medicine, that was enough. Parents could not read the small print, and often could not read it at all. Many mothers could not read, and those who could did not understand Latin words. And why? After all, a pharmacist is a respectable person. He wears a white apron. His hands are clean. He speaks calmly. And most importantly, he does not shout. And in a world where everyone shouts, factories, bosses, children, markets, streets, a calm voice seems like salvation. Bottles of silent syrups were available in many pharmacies. They had different names, different labels, different manufacturers, but the promise was the same: sleep, silence, peace. And every year the demand grew. Because cities grew, rooms became more cramped, working days became longer, and patients became shorter. Children were born often. They lived in cramped conditions. They got sick. They cried. And no one taught mothers how to cope with exhaustion. They were taught only one thing: not to disturb. Therefore, the bottle became a part of everyday life, like soap, like tea, like bread. It was put in a cupboard, on a shelf, next to bandages and herbs. And over time, it ceased to be medicine. It became a habit. But in every pharmacy there were stories about the child who slept for days, about the baby who stopped waking up for feeding, about the boy who became too quiet. These stories were not recorded in magazines. They were whispered about. Have you heard of Mary from Bromley? They say her little one never woke up again. But she gave him the same drops as everyone else. Such conversations quickly ended, because no one wanted to be next. And the pharmacists heard these rumors too. But they had their own logic. It's rare. It's a coincidence. Children are weak as they are. It's not because of the syrup. And every time a new mother walked into the store, this logic was easier to accept than to question the entire business. Because if you admit that the bottle is dangerous, then what do you sell instead? Patience? You can't buy it. Peace? You can't boil it. Sleep? You can't pour it into a glass. But syrup is possible. It was in pharmacies that silence began to take the form of a commodity. It was weighed. It was poured. It was wrapped in paper. It was passed over the counter with the check. And with each bottle sold, the story grew bigger. More than one family, more than one street, more than one pharmacy. It wasn't advice anymore. It was an industry. But sooner or later, any silence begins to sound. And in the next chapter, we will go to where silence first began to be noticed not as a blessing, but as a problem. To where doctors began to ask uncomfortable questions, and to where the first cases appeared that could not be hushed up. Because not all children woke up, and not all mothers could remain silent. Children who slept too long. There are places where silence is not soothing. There are places where it is alarming. Hospitals, asylums, workers' infirmaries. In Victorian London, they were all similar. Long corridors, white walls, the smell of soap and carbolic acid, heavy doors that closed without a sound. They didn't like noise here, but they didn't like strange coincidences even more. Because doctors, no matter how conservative they were, knew how to notice patterns. They were used to illnesses, to deaths, to weak bodies and difficult diagnoses. But they weren't used to one thing: to children who slept too deeply, for too long, and woke up not the same as before. Imagine a hospital ward. Early morning. Light filters through the misted windows. The nurse opens the door without knocking. The footsteps are quiet, so as not to wake the child. The children are lying in their beds. Some are breathing rapidly. Others are breathing slowly. Some are whimpering softly in their sleep. Some are lying motionless, with even, almost mechanical breathing. Sometimes the doctor stays by the bed a little longer, because sleep here does not look like rest. It looks like absence. The eyes are closed, but the eyelids do not tremble. The hands are warm, but the body does not react. The child does not wake up from either the voice or the touch. "How long has she been like this?" the doctor asks. "Since last night," the nurse answers. "The mother said she gave the syrup." This phrase is repeated over and over. "Gived the syrup. After the drops. I drank it and fell asleep right away. It was such a quiet night." The doctors start listening more carefully, because in medicine, coincidences happen. But when there are a lot of them, it's no longer a coincidence. In the children's shelters, the picture was even more disturbing. Those who couldn't be fed lived here. Those who were abandoned. Those who were born at the wrong time. Children slept several in one room, and when someone cried, everyone cried. Silence was especially valued here, and when the opportunity arose to make the night quiet, it was accepted without hesitation. The teachers were exhausted. The nannies worked 16-hour days. There was not enough money, and the bottles appeared again. Not from official supplies, not according to prescriptions, and because of familiar pharmacists, benefactors, doctors who considered it a practical solution. But over time, strange things began to be noticed in the shelters. The children became less active. They ran less. They laughed less. They fought less. It would seem like a dream, but at the same time, they became more silent, more withdrawn, more slower. Some did not react to toys. Some looked through people. Some sat for hours without moving. And the teachers began to ask, "Is this normal?" The first doctors who dared to talk about this were not revolutionaries. They did not seek scandals. They did not want to destroy the system. They simply saw the children, and they saw that something was wrong with them. Cautious notes began to appear in medical journals. No loud headlines, no direct accusations. The phrases sounded dry. Cases of excessive sleepiness in infants. Prolonged deep sleep after taking calming syrups. Changes in behavior in children after regular use of home mixtures. No one wrote the word danger. No one used the word harm. But it was clear between the lines. Something was happening. Hospitals began to make lists, unofficial, for themselves. Age, symptoms, what was treated, what was given at home. And again and again and again, the same line appeared. Quiet syrup, calming drops, soothing mixture. Different names, the essence is the same. Let's imagine a young doctor. He doesn't come from a rich family. He believes in progress. He reads new magazines. He believes that medicine should protect, not soothe. He walks into the ward and sees a boy, 7 years old, thin, pale, too quiet for his age. "When was the last time he played?" the doctor asks. The mother shrugs. "I don't remember. He's almost always asleep." "What do you give him?" She hesitates. Then she takes a bottle from her bag, the same one. The doctor takes it in his hands, reads the label, turns it in his fingers. "Who advised you to do that?" "The pharmacist, the neighbor. Everyone does it." It's the same phrase again. Everyone does it. The doctor puts the bottle on the table and looks at the child. He doesn't see a monster. He sees fatigue. He sees a family that wants peace and a system that sells it in glass. It is in hospitals that a different attitude towards silence begins to emerge. Silence ceases to be simply a blessing. It becomes a symptom. And with each new case, fear begins to change form. It is no longer a fear of crying. It is a fear that crying may not return. Because if a child doesn't cry, maybe he isn't suffering. Or maybe he simply can't. In the glass where the truth hidden. University laboratories were not like pharmacies. Here they did not sell hope. Here they did not whisper advice. Here they did not reassure mothers. Here they cut the truth into thin layers. They weighed it on precise scales. They heated it over a flame and watched it change color. The laboratories smelled not of herbs and syrups, but of metal, acids, smoke, and alcohol. Here there was a different kind of silence, concentrated, tense, cold. The silence in which one does not sleep. The silence in which one listens to a drop fall into a glass. This is where the same bottles began to be brought, without beautiful stories, without maternal tears, without excuses, simply as samples. A chemistry professor from Edinburgh received the first bottle in a nondescript wooden box. No letter, no signature, just a note. "Sample of a soothing syrup for children. Please examine the composition." He placed it on the table. He looked at the dark liquid inside. He slowly unscrewed the cork. The smell was sweet, almost pleasant, like caramel. But beneath the sweetness was something else. Bitter, metallic, wrong. He dipped a glass rod into the liquid. The drop reached out, reluctantly falling back. "Interesting," he said, and he began to work. Victorian chemistry was no longer alchemy. It was science, with formulas, with tables, with precise reactions. And what they began to find in these syrups did not fit into the idea of home remedies. Each sample was different. The recipes changed from pharmacy to pharmacy, but there was one thing in common. The liquids contained substances that were not supposed to calm the child, but to turn him off. Not to cure, but to muffle. Not to help, but to force him to be silent. The first reports were cautious. Potent components were detected. The composition does not correspond to the declared safety. The substances have a powerful effect on the nervous system. The words were dry, scientific, but behind them stood something that was frightening. Because these substances were not intended for children's organisms, not for small bodies, not for hearts that are just learning to beat rhythmically, but they were cheap, affordable, and effective. Too effective. Imagine a professor reading the results. He sits at a desk. In front of him are papers, flasks, records. Outside the window is a foggy morning. He looks at the formulas, at the numbers, at the reactions, and he understands. This is not a mistake. This is not a coincidence. This is a system. Because such mixtures do not appear just like that. They are created intentionally. They are repeated. They are improved. Someone experimented. Someone selected the proportions. Someone was looking for the perfect formula for silence. And this someone knew very well what he was doing. Conversations begin in scientific circles. Not public, not loud. For now. Letters between universities. Discussions in closed sessions. Reports to ministries. The words dangerous and children begin to stand side by side. And with this comes fear. Because if this is true, then tens of thousands of bottles have already been distributed throughout the cities. So thousands of children have been drinking these syrups. So the silence that everyone considered a blessing could have been a consequence. But the system does not like to be stopped. Pharmacists did not want problems. Manufacturers did not want inspections. Officials did not want panic. And when the first professors spoke louder, they were politely answered. There is no evidence yet. Additional research is needed. There is no need to scare the population. Because if mothers stop buying syrup, they will start demanding other help. And that means expenses, reforms, changes. It would have been much easier to leave everything as it is. But the truth has one strange property. It doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And when there is too much of it, it comes out. Through newspapers, through courts, through scandals, through mothers who could no longer remain silent. When silence became a scandal. Newspapers do not like silence. They feed on noise, fear, indignation, and human curiosity. And when the truth about silent syrups began to leak from the laboratories into the corridors of the editorial offices, it immediately took on a different sound. What was a home remedy yesterday became a potential threat today. What was called a salvation for mothers was turning into a dangerous experiment on children. Journalists loved such stories because it had everything: innocence, trust, fear, mystery, and something very similar to a crime. The first high-profile material appeared in the morning edition of one of the London newspapers. On the front page was a big black word: Silent Children, the Price of Peace. Underneath it was the story of a family from a working-class neighborhood. No names, no addresses, but with details that couldn't be made up. Mother, baby, syrup, night. And a morning that didn't start with crying. The article didn't accuse directly. It asked questions. Do parents know what they're giving their children? Who checks the ingredients of these medications? Why doesn't anyone warn about the consequences? And most importantly, how many more children are sleeping too deeply? The city woke up. In cafes, newspapers were read aloud. In markets, headlines were discussed. In lines outside pharmacies, mothers looked at each other with suspicion. The pharmacists were nervous. They saw the changing attitudes of their customers. Is this really safe? Did you read it in the newspaper? And what did the doctors say? The same bottles that yesterday were taken in silence, today they were taken with doubt. And some, they no longer took them at all. And then the doctors spoke. Those who had been silent for years. Those who had seen strange cases. Those who had made lists in their notebooks. They gave interviews. They wrote letters. They spoke at meetings. Carefully, without tantrums, but firmly. They talked about excessive drowsiness, about changes in behavior, about dangerous mixtures, about lack of control. And every word added fuel to the fire. The officials were most afraid because the scandal meant inspections, and inspections meant that someone was not looking, that someone was turning a blind eye, that someone was allowing it. And when the story went beyond London, it became clear it could no longer be stopped. Newspapers in Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham reprinted materials, added their stories, their names, their tragedies. Silence was no longer a private matter of families. It had become a matter of the state. Let's imagine a courtroom, high ceiling, wooden benches, the smell of dust and paper. In the dock is a manufacturer of sedative syrups, well-dressed, confident, with a calm face. He is asked questions. Did you check the composition of your mixtures? Did you warn of possible consequences? Did you know to whom you were selling? He answers cautiously. Our products meet the requirements. We work according to traditional recipes. We are not doctors. We are manufacturers. In the hall are mothers, those who remember the night when it became too quiet, those who cannot forget the look of a child who is no longer woke up, those who had blamed themselves for years, and now they listen to their pain being called tradition. Society was divided. Some demanded a ban. Others spoke of exaggeration. Still others accused mothers of frivolity. Because simple stories always scare, and complex ones demand responsibility. But every time someone tried to reduce everything to coincidences, a new article appeared, a new letter, a new family, and the silence sounded again. The government was forced to react. Commissions were created. Inspections were appointed. The first restrictions were prepared. But the industry was not going to give up. Manufacturers changed names. They changed labels. They wrote in smaller font. Instead of quiet syrup, calming drops, soothing mixture, gentle night tonic, the same bottles, the same promises, the same consequences. And here the real struggle begins, between those who want silence at any cost and those who are no longer ready to be silent. Because it is no longer about syrup, and not even about pharmacies. The point is whether society has the right to sell peace if its price is children's lives. When silence became a scandal. Newspapers do not like silence. They feed on noise, fear, indignation, and human curiosity. And when the truth about silent syrups began to leak from the laboratories into the corridors of the editorial offices, it immediately took on a different sound. What was a home remedy yesterday became a potential threat today. What was called a salvation for mothers was turning into a dangerous experiment on children. Journalists loved such stories because it had everything: innocence, trust, fear, mystery, and something very similar to a crime. The first high-profile material appeared in the morning edition of one of the London newspapers. On the front page was a big black word: Silent Children, the Price of Peace. Underneath it was the story of a family from a working-class neighborhood. No names, no addresses, but with details that couldn't be made up. Mother, baby, syrup, night, and a morning that didn't start with crying. The article didn't accuse directly. It asked questions. Do parents know what they're giving their children? Who checks the ingredients of these medications? Why doesn't anyone warn about the consequences? And most importantly, how many more children are sleeping too deeply? The city woke up. In cafes, Newspapers were read aloud. In markets, headlines were discussed. In lines outside pharmacies, mothers looked at each other with suspicion. The pharmacists were nervous. They saw the changing attitudes of their customers. Is this really safe? Did you read it in the newspaper? And what did the doctors say? The same bottles that yesterday were taken in silence, today they were taken with doubt. And some, they no longer took them at all. And then the doctors spoke. Those who had been silent for years. Those who had seen strange cases. Those who had made lists in their notebooks. They gave interviews. They wrote letters. They spoke at meetings. Carefully, without tantrums, but firmly. They talked about excessive drowsiness, about changes in behavior, about dangerous mixtures, about lack of control. And every word added fuel to the fire. The officials were most afraid, because the scandal meant inspections, and inspections meant that someone was not looking, that someone was turning a blind eye, that someone was allowing it. And when the story went beyond London, it became clear it could no longer be stopped. Newspapers in Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham reprinted materials, added their stories, their names, their tragedies. Silence was no longer a private matter of families. It had become a matter of the state. Let's imagine a courtroom, high ceiling, wooden benches, the smell of dust and paper. In the dock is a manufacturer of sedative syrups, well-dressed, confident, with a calm face. He is asked questions. Did you check the composition of your mixtures? Did you warn of possible consequences? Did you know to whom you were selling? He answers cautiously. Our products meet the requirements. We work according to traditional recipes. We are not doctors. We are manufacturers. In the hall are mothers, those who remember the night when it became too quiet, those who cannot forget the look of a child who has no longer woke up, those who had blamed themselves for years. And now they listen to their pain being called tradition. Society was divided. Some demanded a ban. Others spoke of exaggeration. Still others accused mothers of frivolity. Because simple stories always scare, and complex ones demand responsibility. But every time someone tried to reduce everything to coincidences, a new article appeared, a new letter, a new family, and the silence sounded again. The government was forced to react. Commissions were created. Inspections were appointed. The first restrictions were prepared. But the industry was not going to give up. Manufacturers changed names. They changed labels. They wrote in smaller font. Instead of quiet syrup, calming drops, soothing mixture, gentle night tonic, the same bottles, the same promises, the same consequences. And here the real struggle begins, between those who want silence at any cost and those who are no longer ready to be silent. Because it is no longer about syrup, and not even about pharmacies. The point is whether society has the right to sell peace if its price is children's lives.
Mothers who never forgot silence.
There is a silence that can be forgotten, a sleepless night, an empty room, a house where everyone has gone. But there is a silence that remains forever. It lives in memory. It comes in dreams. It sounds when the house becomes too quiet again. This was the silence that the mothers of Victorian England remembered. They were not written about in the newspapers. Their names did not appear in the court records. They did not speak at meetings. They simply lived on, with memories, with guilt, with questions that no one could answer. Let's imagine one of them. Her name was Elizabeth. She lived in a small house near the docks. Her husband worked as a longshoreman. She washed clothes for wealthy families. Their son was born weak. He cried a lot. He didn't sleep at night. A neighbor recommended syrup. "Everyone gives it," she said. "Children sleep like angels after it." And Elizabeth believed it. Because she was tired. Because she was scared. Because she didn't know what to do. She remembered the first night very well. He fell asleep immediately, so quickly that she didn't have time to finish her prayer. She sat by the bed and listened to his breathing, at first with relief, then with anxiety. He slept until morning, and it seemed like a miracle. Then there were other nights. He slept longer, deeper, quieter. He stopped waking up from noise. He stopped reaching for toys. He stopped laughing like before. But he didn't cry, and that seemed like a blessing. One morning, she couldn't hear him breathing. She stood by the bed for a long time, afraid to touch, afraid to understand. And when she did touch him, he was cold. Such stories didn't make it into official reports. The certificate said, "Weak health, complications." The neighbors said, "God's will." The man was silent, because they didn't talk about tears on the docks. And only Elizabeth knew that the silence that morning was different. It was final. There were those whose children survived, but they had changed. Children who had become silent, who didn't run, who looked through people. Mothers saw it, they felt it, but they were silent. Because how could you tell the world that you yourself had given something that could harm your child? In Victorian society, the mother was responsible for everything, for cleanliness, for order, for morality, for the children. And if something went wrong, it was her fault. So they were silent, and they carried their silence inside. Some of them began to fear peace. When the house became too quiet, they woke up in the middle of the night. They went to the children's room. They stood by the bed. They listened to the breathing. And only then did they return. Silence became the enemy. It no longer meant sleep. It meant danger. These women did not consider themselves victims of history. They considered themselves guilty. And that was the most terrible part of the whole tragedy. Because the real system was never acknowledged. Manufacturers changed their names. Pharmacists were silent. Officials wrote new rules. And mothers were left with memories. When society started to hear children. Sometimes history changes not through laws, not through orders, not through decrees. It changes when someone can no longer remain silent. This is how the slow breakdown of that era began. Not from the rostrums, not from the halls of Parliament, but from kitchens, where mothers sat by the windows and looked at empty cots, and from hospital wards, where children no longer cried. In the Victorian world, a child was not considered a person for a long time. She was a future worker, a future servant, a future soldier. Her body was valued only to the extent that it could work. Her voice was considered noise. Her crying was a problem. But after the scandals with silent syrups, something began to change. New words appeared in the newspapers: protection of children, responsibility of adults, right to safety. Words that had seemed strange 10 years before. Committees began to be formed in charitable societies. Women from high society who had never worked in factories, and women from working-class neighborhoods who had never known fatigue from books, found themselves in the same room. They talked about the same things: about children, about sleep, about fear, about bottles that still stood in cupboards. The first public meetings began. In church halls, in schools, in public buildings. Doctors gave lectures. They explained what dangerous mixtures were. They talked about the child's body, about the fragile heart, about weak lungs, and mothers listened. Many people have heard for the first time that silence can be a symptom, that sleep does not always mean health, that peace is sometimes bought at a price. Imagine such a hall: wooden benches, the smell of candles, the muffled hum of conversations. On stage is a doctor. He does not speak like a professor. He speaks like a person who has seen too much. He does not accuse. He explains. And someone in the hall begins to cry, because in these words they recognize their own night, their own bottle, their own silence. Gradually, a new idea of childhood emerges. A child is not just a small adult, not just a workforce in waiting. A child is an organism that is being formed, a consciousness that is just waking up, a life that is easy to break. This understanding was revolutionary. Under pressure from society, the authorities were forced to act more seriously. The first laws appeared, which prohibited the sale of sedative mixtures without a prescription. The first inspections of pharmacies appeared. The first fines. The first closed production facilities. But most importantly, the fear of responsibility appeared. The pharmacist could no longer simply say, "Everyone does it." Now he had to think. Changes also began in families. Mothers began to consult among themselves, not about syrups, but about lullabies, songs, and sleep rituals. The first books began to appear about caring for children, about regimen, about nutrition, about peace without a bottle. It was a quiet revolution, slow, uneven, but real. However, old habits do not disappear immediately. In poor areas, shady mixtures were still used for a long time. In remote towns, pharmacists had been selling silent help for years. Prescriptions were passed down through families. Silence didn't seem easy. But now it was under suspicion, and that changed everything. Because when society starts listening to children, it can't go back. When silence turned into the new century. Stories rarely end where we want them to. They don't disappear with laws. They don't dissolve with the resignations of officials. They don't evaporate with new textbooks. They change shape. And silence, once sold in heavy glass bottles with vintage labels, did not disappear with the Victorian era. It simply became more modern. The beginning of the 20th century brought a new language, new words, new promises. Silent syrups were replaced by scientific remedies, medically approved formulas, proven sedatives. Now the bottles look different. Neater, lighter, with stamps, seals, signatures. And again, they wrote the same thing on them, only in different words. Sleep, peace, relief. In the 20th century, people began to trust not pharmacists, but brands. not neighbors, but advertising. Not rumors, but newspaper ads with smiling mothers. On the posters, children slept in clean cribs. Mothers looked at them with relief. Fathers went to work rested. And under all this was the slogan, "Now your night will be peaceful." The world became faster. Factories became bigger. Cities became noisier. Work became harder. And sleep became currency again. People worked 10 to 12-hour days. They lived in cramped apartments. They raised their children in the noise of traffic and factory sirens. And the desire for silence did not disappear. Now it looked civilized. Medicines were sold in pharmacies with neon signs. They were prescribed by doctors in white coats. They were advertised in women's magazines. Everything looked right. But the essence remained. A small body, great fatigue of adults, and a quick solution. Familiar stories began to appear in hospitals again. Too deep sleep, too slow awakening, changes in behavior. And again, the doctors began to ask questions. But now they had different tools, analyses, tests, studies. And what was previously hidden in syrups was now found in pills. Imagine a children's ward in the 1930s. Bright windows, metal beds, the smell of medicine and soap. A nurse comes in with a tray. On the tray are pills, small, white, neat. She puts one on the child's tongue, gives water, and the child falls asleep. Quickly, calmly, without crying. Parents are grateful. Doctors are satisfied. The system works. But some remembered. Old doctors who still found Victorian syrups. Professors who read old reports. Mothers who did not forget silence. They looked at new drugs with caution, because they knew the name may change, the form may change, and the temptation will remain. In the middle of the 20th century, new discussions began about what healthy sleep is, about the line between treatment and convenience, about whether medicine has the right to turn off a child. And once again, society found itself faced with the old question, can silence be bought? In some countries, strict restrictions appeared. In others, soft recommendations. Somewhere, drugs were sold only by prescription. Somewhere, almost freely. The world was different, and the need was the same. The history of silent medicines became part of the educational programs. It was studied as an example of how easily care can turn into control, and how quickly good intentions become dangerous. But in everyday life, people rarely think about history. When a child cries for the third night in a row, when eyes are sticky from fatigue, when tomorrow you have to go back to work, the memory of Victorian bottles seems very distant. And here history comes full circle, because silence is once again becoming a commodity, again a promise, again a temptation. And the question is no longer whether silent cures exist, but whether we remember where they came from.
When the past looks at us from the pharmacy shelf,
Modern pharmacies look different. Bright light, clean shelves, neat boxes with colorful inscriptions, smiling consultants, fast cash registers. There are no dark bottles with sealing wax, no handwritten labels, no smell of alcohol and herbs. But the promise remains: sleep, peace, silence. We live in a world that does not like to wait. Delivery in a day. Answer in a second. work without pauses, news without end. And sleep has become a problem again. Children do not fall asleep, wake up at night, cry, toss and turn. And parents get tired, just like 100 years ago. Only now, instead of a neighbor with advice, there is the internet. Forums, blogs, advertising. And the words appear again. Natural remedy, gentle formula, safe for children, approved by experts. Sounds familiar. Imagine a modern night, an apartment. The phone screen glows in the dark. The child is awake. The mother is flipping through reviews. It helped from the first night. The child falls asleep in 10 minutes. Finally, peace. She reads and thinks not about history. She thinks about tomorrow, about work, about fatigue, about another sleepless night. And when she presses the order button, she is doing the same thing that mothers did 100 years ago. She is buying silence. Modern medicine knows more. It knows about the phases of sleep, about the nervous system, about brain development, about hormones. It talks about the regime, about rituals, about light and darkness, about peace without drugs. But the market is always nearby, and where there is a need, there is always a product. Today, silence is sold differently, in the form of drops, syrups, teas, vitamins, supplements. It is packaged in boxes with cute pictures. It is called care. It is advertised as help. And the line between treatment and convenience is becoming thin again. Doctors today speak carefully. They say, every child is individual. There is no universal remedy. Sleep is a process. But they also know that parents want a quick solution, and sometimes they give it. Because the system hasn't changed. Only the scenery has changed. Modern research shows that sleep is not just rest. It is the formation of memory, emotions, character, consciousness. And any interference with this process is an interference with a person, small, defenseless, who cannot say no. And here the past returns, not in the form of a scandal, not in the form of courts, but in the form of a question that every parent asks himself at night. I want peace, but I don't want to do harm. And between these two desires lies the whole history of quiet medicine. We no longer live in Victorian London, but we live in a world that is just as afraid of sleepless nights. And when we look at the drugstore shelves, we're not just looking at the modern boxes. We're looking back, into those rooms, into those pharmacies, into those bottles. And the question now is different. Have we learned to listen to children? Have we learned to wait? Have we learned to live without quick decisions? The temptation of silence. The story of silent medicines has never been just about syrups, and not even just about children. It was about temptation, about that moment when a person is so tired that he is ready to believe any promise, about that night when it seems that one more hour without sleep and you can't stand it anymore, about that state when you want not a solution, but simply silence. Every era has its own bottles. In the Victorian era, heavy, dark, with old labels. In the 20th century, neat, medically designed. In the 21st century, bright boxes with cute pictures. But behind all of them is the same desire, to make the night quiet, to make life manageable, to make the world more convenient. Silence always seems innocent. She doesn't look threatening. She doesn't scream. She doesn't break down the door. She comes softly, sits down next to you, and whispers, "I'll help." The story of Victorian syrups has taught the world several hard lessons. The first is about trust. People trusted pharmacies just as they trust brands today, and that trust was exploited. The second is about fatigue. An exhausted person doesn't think about the consequences. They think about survival. The third is about responsibility. The system always finds an excuse, and the families pay for it. When we look back, it seems to us that those mothers should have guessed, that they should have been more careful, that they shouldn't have trusted. But history is not written from the height of centuries. It is written from dark rooms, from children's cries, from sleepless nights. And in these conditions, the solution always seems simpler than it is. Let's imagine one of those mothers, not from the newspapers, not from court cases, ordinary. She didn't want to hurt. She wanted to sleep. She wanted to get up in the morning. She wanted to work. She wanted to stay awake. And when they told her, "It's safe, everyone does it," she believed it because the world had taught her to be ashamed of crying. Silence is always a compromise between patience and convenience, between care and control, between love and fatigue. And each generation makes its own choice. Today we talk about conscious parenting, about psychology, about the needs of the child, about boundaries, but the temptation has not disappeared. It has simply become more polite, better designed, better packaged. And here we return to the main question of this story. Why does humanity buy silence again and again? Because silence is an illusion of control. It gives the feeling that chaos can be turned off, that life can be paused. But life is not paused. It is either lived or muted. The story of silent medicines is not a story about the past. It is a story about us, about how we treat the weak, to those who cannot defend themselves, to those whose voice is too quiet, and about whether we are ready to listen to this voice, even when we really want silence. The room where the light is always on. The night always begins the same way. The lights go out. The city falls silent. The rooms fill with shadows. And somewhere in that darkness, there is always a child's room. A small bed. A blanket that rises and falls with your breath. A lamp left on overnight. This is where every story of silence begins. Imagine this room. It could be in London in 1880, with heavy curtains and the smell of dampness. It could be in Manchester in the 1920s, with a metal bed and white walls. It could be in a modern apartment, with a star-shaped nightlight and toys on a shelf. But in each of them there is one thing in common: waiting. Expectation that the child will fall asleep, that the night will pass peacefully, that there will be no crying, that there will be no fear. And there is always a choice nearby: to wait, to sit by the bed, to stroke the head, to hear breathing, or to find a shorter way. In the Victorian world, this short way was in a glass bottle, dark, heavy, cold. In the 20th century, in a pill, neat, white, with instructions. Today, in a box with a cute picture and the inscription, for a peaceful sleep. The form changes. Desire not. The story of Mother's Quiet Syrup is not only about medicine. It is a story about human fatigue, about the fear of not being able to cope, about the pressure of society, about the shame of a child's crying, about a world that wants children to be comfortable. But childhood is not made for silence. It is made for voice, for movement, for tears, for laughter, for life. Once upon a time, mothers in Victorian England thought that they were buying peace. They didn't know that they were buying risk, that they were buying silence that could become final. They were not angry, they were tired. And this is the most terrible part of this story, because real tragedies are not born of cruelty. They are born of hopelessness. When there is no support, when there is no knowledge, when there is no choice.
And then the bottle
Becomes hope. And silence is salvation. Today we know more. We are talking about psychology, about brain development, about safe sleep, about the importance of presence. But we also live in a world of fatigue, and every night poses the same question. Are we ready to listen? Are we ready to wait? Are we ready to be there, even when it's hard? Silence is not always peace. History has taught us this at a high price. It left us not bottles, not recipes, not prohibitions. It left us memories. About those nights, about those rooms, about those mothers who just wanted their children to fall asleep. And maybe that's why this story is important, because it's not about the past. It's about us, about how we choose, about what we fear, about what we consider normal. When you turn off the lights today and the city becomes quiet again, remember, silence is not a goal. Silence is a pause between the breaths of life, and in this pause there should always be a place for a voice. If this story made you think, if it left a mark, if such quiet, deep bedtime stories are important to you, support the channel by subscribing. This will help us continue these stories, quietly, slowly, for the evening light.